Hi, it's Len Cameraman from Hero Technical Solutions, and in this training video I'm going to show you how to get more mileage out of your ACT software by taking advantage of the functionality offered by groups. In this session we're going to cover reasons to use groups. We'll talk about some different things you can do with them and different creative ways that you can take advantage of them. We'll show you the two different group types. We have static groups and dynamic groups, which really differ in the way that contacts are added to those groups. It's kind of manual versus automatic. We'll talk about the features offered by groups and the things that you can do once you have your group set up. We'll also look at ways to repurpose the group. So we'll take the group record in ACT and find ways to use it beyond just simply grouping contacts. And then, once you've seen how to use groups, I'll show you a few additional tips and tricks to get even more out of this feature. So, reasons to use groups. You can group contacts by type. Maybe you'll put your customers in one group, prospects in another group. You could have members in a group, or people who are vendors or lawyers that work with your contacts. You can segment your contacts and create different lists and keep those lists in a group inside of ACT. You could create a mailing list or some type of marketing list. Maybe you want to have a list to keep track of who you're going to send Christmas cards to, and you could set up that as a list within ACT. We'll get more into examples of repurposing, but one of the things that you could use a group for would be project management. You could group together all of the contacts who are working on a particular project and keep information about that project on the group record. If you do any kind of training, classes or seminars, you could keep track of people who have registered or who have attended your classes by creating a group for that class and then keeping details of the class on that group record. And then what I think is the most interesting thing to show people about ACT and about the groups that they haven't used before is how to repurpose the group. Okay, so how to take the group and creatively use it for something else. We're going to talk about dynamic groups versus static. Okay, so dynamic groups are groups where you basically set up a rule and let contacts automatically fall into the right groups, versus static, which is where you are setting up a group and then hand-picking which contacts will belong to that group. Let's create a new group and use the static method of adding contacts to that group. I'm just going to create a new one here for test purposes. Clicking on new and my test group. Let's call it static. Okay, and then we're going to click add and remove contacts. And when we add static contacts to the group, we click on this button for contacts here under the static section. And now I can hand pick contacts from my database. I can pick as many as I want. There's no limit to how many contacts you can add to a group. And when I'm done, I click OK. I click OK again here. And now on my Contacts tab for this group, I have the contacts that I've picked. There are 4 of them. I see some details from their contact records. And now let's take a look at how we can dynamically add contacts to a group instead. Okay, so I'm going to create another group for this. Let's call this test group dynamic. And this time I'm going to click the add and remove contacts button. But what I'm going to do is, instead of adding static members, I'm going to add dynamic members. So I'll click on the edit criteria button. And now this screen allows me to create criteria. So for example, let's say that we want to have anyone who is a customer automatically end up in this group. So in the field name, I'm going to choose ID status, which is ACT's funny word for category, and say contains customer. I have to use contains because ACT allows me to pick more than one thing for ID status, so I don't want it just equal to customer. I actually want it to contain customer. I click add to list, and now you can see this line has been added to my criteria. It's a contact record, the field name is ID status, and I want it to contain customer. If I hit preview, it shows me how many results I'll get, and it shows them to me in a list. So I get 66 total here. If I'm happy with that, I click on OK. And I click OK again. And now, I didn't manually have to pick these contacts. They got added automatically. This means that when I add a new contact to my database, all I have to do is make sure that I have the right rules set up for my groups, and that I'm filling in the fields for these contacts. So when I put a new contact in their customer, as long as I make sure that I pick customer in the ID status field, let's take a look at one of these contacts so you can see that here. If we find ID status, they're a customer. As long as I have that filled in, the contact will automatically end up in the right group. So I don't have to spend time managing who is in what group. I just need to set up those rules properly. Okay, so let's go back to our groups, and we'll take a look at a couple of things that we can do with static members. Okay, so here's my test group again. I go to Add Remove Contacts on the Contacts tab. I click the Contacts button. And now I can scroll through my entire list of contacts if I want and add contacts one at a time that way. Or I might type in someone's name and add them that way to save me some scrolling. What you can also do is you can do a lookup first. So let's close this. Let's go back to our contacts. And I know that there are some contacts in New York that I want to add to my group. So what I can do first is I'm going to do a lookup on the city field, and the shortcut for that is to right click in the city field here, go to Lookup City, and I'm going to enter New York. Okay, now I get 16 contacts. So now if I go back to my groups, and I'm still on my static test group here that I created, and I go to Add Remove Contacts, I go back to Contacts again. Now I'm going to change this. So instead of choosing from all contacts, I'm going to choose from the current lookup. Now it's narrowed it down, and I only have 16 contacts to pick from. So I know that I wanted to add a couple of contacts from New York, and I've found them, I've added them to my list, and I click OK there. So you can scroll through the whole list and pick them. You can do a lookup first to add them, or you can add them directly from the contact record. So let's go to our contacts. I'm going to go take a look at my entire list of contacts, and now I'm going to just pick one of these contacts here at random. And if I go to the Groups and Companies tab, I can click on the Add Remove Groups button, find the group that I want to add to, and I can double click it, or I can click this arrow button here, and they get added to this group. Okay, so now that group shows up there. I can navigate to the group by double clicking, and I can get back to any contact in this group by clicking the blue hyperlink. Now let's take a look at dynamic groups again and how to work with those, and we'll do another example. So I know that in my ID status field I am categorizing my contacts through this list here. So let's make a list of all of our customers that are in New York. So let's go to Groups, and I'm going to use the test group that I created before already. So I'm going to go back to my dynamic test group here. I'm going to go to Add Remove Contacts, and then I'm going to edit the criteria. Okay, so I have this line originally. Now I want to add another line to this. You can add as many lines of criteria as you want. So I also want to find my contacts that are in New York State. We looked at New York City before, but now we want to find customers who are in New York State. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to look for the state field. I can just type S and that'll scroll me ahead a bit. And I'll scroll down until I get to state. And I say equal to, I could just type NY, but I wasn't sure whether it was New York or NY in the list, so I hit the drop down, I add it to the list, and now if I hit preview, I get 4 contacts. And I'll click OK here. And I'm actually going to rename this group. I'm going to call this Customers in New York. Okay, and I've got them added there. Now, that allows me to create criteria. Now, if you're wondering, can I add these from the tab for a contact? Well, if you add a contact to a group via the tab, so let's go and pick another contact at random here. Let's scroll up to the top of our list. We'll pick someone. You can add them to a group. But if you add them to a group, they're added as a static contact. That means they're not going to have to follow the rule for that group. And they'll be added regardless of whether they meet it or not. So if I added them to customers in New York, they get added, but they are not a dynamic contact for that group. They're static. They're always going to be there unless I manually pull them out again. Also, static contacts have their groups show up here. So let's go back to our groups and we'll go to our static contacts and take a look at one of these. Go to this record. I can see on this group tab that the group shows up. But if I go to one of our contacts added to the dynamic group here, let's go to Andy's record. I don't see any groups here. That's because groups only show up if the contact is a static member. If you want to see groups that they're a dynamic member of, you have to hit this button first. And they basically do that for performance reasons in ACT. Otherwise, what happens is every time you'd pull up a contact record, ACT would have to check all the rules for your groups to find out if the contact belongs to that group or not. So you need to click the button for that to happen. And then you can see fairly quickly, these are the groups that contact belongs to. Okay, let's take a look at some group features. One of the great features of groups is the ability to have notes, history, and activities rolled up from the contacts that belong in that group. And what I mean by that is if I have a group that contains contacts and I go to the Notes tab, I can see all the notes for all the contacts that belong to that group. I can also see the same thing on history. This is history for all the contacts in the group, and I've got activities for those 4 contacts in this case as well. In addition to being able to roll up that information to the group level, I can also attach a note to just the group. It doesn't belong to any specific contact, but when I go into the notes here, I could see it. To do that, you just go to the Notes tab, you insert a new note, and I would just fill in the details here. Okay, and I click OK. Now this won't show up on any specific contact, but it is associated with the group. And I can change whether I'm showing notes for the group and group members, or I can show it for just the contacts that belong to the group, or I can filter this to show notes that belong just to the group itself. I also have the ability to have subgroups to help me keep organized. So we created a Customers in New York group, but we actually have a main customers group and then subgroups under that. So what I can do is I can actually drag this Customers in New York group into Customers, and ACT asks me to confirm that I want to move that group to this location, and I say yes. And that helps me keep a little bit more organized. One thing to note is that these contacts in these groups do not automatically show up in the parent group. It's just for organizing the groups. I'll show you a way later to get some of that to happen, but just know that just because the contact is in a group here doesn't mean they're going to be in the parent group. Also, if I wanted to create a subgroup directly rather than create one and move it, I just pick the group that I want to be the parent. I click the new group drop-down button here, and I'm going to choose subgroup. And now it's a subgroup right away. Okay, and I put that there. As soon as I save it, it shows up in the list. Customers in California. Okay, now I don't have to move it. It's there already. I can also add custom fields to a group. Our groups are pretty basic here. We have a group name. We've got a description to help remind us what it's for. It shows us the last date that this group was edited and who made those changes. If you look on the tabs below, there is some additional information. We can see the subgroups here that it has. We've got a spot for an address, if that makes sense for this group. And in this database, I've actually added an insurance record using another tool, so that shows up there as well. What I want to show you about this is that you can add custom fields. This is especially useful if you're not just using contacts to group, customers, prospects, and those sort of things, and are using the groups for other purposes. So if you were using groups to keep track of, for example, people in a training class, you may want to use the group record to keep track of information about that class itself. Maybe you want to keep track of the venue that you're using. So let's add that. I'll go to the Tools menu and into Define Fields. And I'm going to create a field for groups. So I was in groups, so this already shows up here. And then I'm going to first create a drop-down list. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. I'll assume that if you're on this advanced training session, you may already know how to create a field. So I'm going to walk through the full thing, but I'm going to go at a pretty good pace here. So follow me. I'm going to click on Manage Drop-Down Lists, and I'm going to create a new drop-down list, and I'm going to call this Locations. It's a character field. I don't want users to be able to add new items in the list. I just want the administrator to do that. And I can add as many locations as I want here. These are going to go into my drop-down, and I click Finish. Now I've got the drop-down. I click the Home button here, and then go to Create a new field for the groups. And I'm going to call this Location. It's a character field, matches up with my drop-down type. And I'm going to use a drop-down list, which is why I created that first. And I'm going to hit L to scroll down to Locations. I'm going to only allow users to pick something from that list. And then 50 characters is probably long enough. I probably won't add anything longer than that. And I'll click Finish. And it's going to add that field to the database. Now in the last couple versions of ACT, when you're done adding the field, it's going to prompt you to make changes to the layout. If you're on an older version, you may have to go in to the layout editor via the Tools menu. So I'm going to modify the layout. I want it on the top of this tab, so I'm going to click on Field. I'm going to drag it out here. Choose Location. Make sure Include a Label is checked off so it drops in location here. I'm going to stretch this out. Okay, and I don't want it bold because the other fields aren't bold. I want it right aligned. I can go in and move this around enough. We won't get too much into how to make layouts pretty here, but you get the idea. We can drop that on, click Save, and close this. And I'm going to drag this down a little bit. And now I can track where my class is being taught. One last feature about the groups that I want to make sure you're aware of is once you have contacts in a group, you can create a lookup simply by right-clicking on the group and saying create lookup, and it takes you to a list of those contacts, which is perfect if you need to go to these contacts and do a mail merge, schedule a phone call, add notes. You want to quickly get this list, that's the way to do it. Again, what I did there is I just went to the group and right-click on the group and create lookup. Let's look at some ways to repurpose the group to track other information beyond just a simple list of contacts that might break them up by type, and find some ways that we can track information we need for our business using the groups. You can repurpose the groups in ACT to track other information besides just lists of contacts. And one of the ways that you can do this is by customizing the fields and the layout of the groups in order to accommodate whatever you want to track. Here are some examples. If you want to track projects, we can do those, and we create a project management layout. We've got a field for the project name, a description, budget, project leader, and start date. You can certainly add to this. I've put in some fields here as an example. I've also got mortgage applications. So we go to the layout for that, and this might be what you customize. So you've got the application number, the primary applicant, whether it's residential or commercial, their annual income, the application date, and you can really add whatever fields you need to be able to track the information about the mortgage application, the project, or let's also take a look at classes. So I have customized a layout to use for classes. Okay, so we've got the class name, the location, the registration fee, and the start date here. And then of course, with any of these groups, I can attach contacts to it, I can have notes, I can have history on it. And because you can have multiple layouts, you don't lose the original group functionality. I still have my good old ACT demo group layout here, and so it works as it always has, but I can also have groups where I've added custom fields to the layout and really allow me to track additional information. You can even rename some of the fields. If you want to rename the group field, you could go to the Tools menu and go to Define Fields, and you can change what you want to call the group name instead. Okay, so if you're really not going to use groups for the original intended purpose and want to totally hijack them and use them for something else, you could change the group name here. Otherwise, what you might just do, as I did in my examples, is I changed the label. So this is still called group name, but in the example of a mortgage application, like this one here, I just changed the label to say application number. Now let's look at a few more tips to advance what you can do with groups. Okay, so the first tip that I want to show you is how to get groups and subgroups to work a little better together when you're using dynamic contact criteria. Okay, so in our example, we've got groups that contain different types of customers. So we've got customers in New York, customers in Asia Pacific region, in Europe, and so on. But because a contact is in here doesn't guarantee that it's going to be in the parent group, and you might want it to work that way. So while there's no automatic way to make that happen by creating these groups, what you can do is set up a rule for the parent group so that it will contain anything that's in the subgroup here. In our case, we have all customers here, and we've got key contacts. Let's take a look at the criteria for key contacts. Okay, so here we're just looking at a field called key contact, and if it's true, they're going to end up in this group. So I want the customers to end up containing anyone who is either a customer or a key contact. So anyone that's going to show up in these groups will end up here. Well, what's the criteria for that? It's just anyone whose ID status contains customer or their key contact field is true. So while I have no contacts in here right now, I can click Add Remove Contacts, click Edit Criteria, and then add my criteria here. So ID status contains customer, and then I'm going to say key contact equal to true. Now, this is AND by default, but I want to make this OR, so I'm going to click the AND OR drop down. So now my criteria is they are a customer, or they're a key contact. Maybe they're both, but they'd still fall into our bucket here. Click on Preview, and I click OK. And now I have them all, so I know that the contacts that are in these groups also show up under my customers group here. You can also attach files to groups. So you probably knew that you could attach files to contacts, but let's take a look at that as well. So if we were working on, let's see, we're going to go back to our projects. I'm going to switch to my layout for that, my project management layout. I could attach a document to this project so I can keep it all in one place. So I'm going to click on Add Document. I'm going to choose File. And on my desktop, I have a project proposal, and I can attach that. ACT will actually make a copy of that database and add it here. I really haven't filled out anything in this file, so it's got a size of 0, but it would tell me how big the file is, last date that it's been modified, and I can add files to it. One neat trick that you can do as well is maybe you don't want to attach all the files into ACT, and you already have a place set up where you want to store the files. We could create a folder on our network drive that we're going to use for project files for our ACT implementation, and then create a field in our group layout that links to that folder. So let me show you how to do that. We're going to create a new field for this, so we're going to go to Tools and then down to Define Fields, and then we're going to create a new field, and we'll call this Project Folder, and the field type is going to be a URL address. Okay, because usually that's where we store a link to a website, but we're actually going to use it to store a link to a folder. Okay, and 128 characters should be long enough. Let's make it a little longer, 200. And now we've created our field. I'm going to close this. We're going to modify our project layout so that we can have access to that here. I'm going to put that field right over here. Project folder, include a label, and I'm going to turn the bold off there. Alright, and that should do it. Again, I could make this a little cleaner, but I'm just going to save that and go ahead and do this. Now, if I was a little smarter when I did this, I might have made the default value for this field, which is one of the options when you create the field, to be file like this. Okay, that's going to save me a little bit of work. I have a projects folder. It's on my N drive, which is on the server. And if this was project number 1003, I would just highlight the path here, put that in behind my project folder, and now I'll click somewhere outside of here. I'm going to click close this so I can show you when I click on this link, it opens up the project folder. Now I store my documents in here, and I've got an easy way to get to it. So all I have to do is the first time I create this project, I put in the folder path there, and then I can link to it from now on. Okay, and then the last tip on the groups, it's only going to apply to ACT premium users, but something worth showing to you is on the group info. Regardless of your version of ACT, you can make this group public, means everyone sees it, or you can make it private, which means only the record manager sees it. The record manager, by default, is the person who created it. You can change that. If it's private, only the record manager sees it. In the premium version of ACT, you have something called limited access, where you can actually go in and choose the specific users and teams that you want to have access to this group record. So I could set up my project so only specific people can pull up this information. that wraps up our group training. I hope you got a lot out of this session and learned some new things that you can use. In our next video, we're going to cover opportunities and talk about how you can use them to track potential business, make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks. And if you don't really need to track new potential business or don't want to do that in ACT, we'll take a look at ways to repurpose the opportunities to track other information as well. You may also want to check out our company website, which is at www.yourcrmhero.com. As well, we have a blog that covers just material related to ACT and nothing else. You can find that at www.exacttactics.com. Thanks again for attending our session today. My name is Len Kammerman. I'm an ACT certified consultant with Hero Technical Solutions, and I will see you next time.